Okay, yeah, well, I think, yeah, so like I said, climate policy, when you try to put it, the thing that like Trudeau's doing that I think is it's polarizing for both sides. So say a carbon tax. One side says, okay, it's not doing anything, it's a waste of time, and the other side saying it's not doing enough, it's not phasing out fossil fuels, especially like, so the example of cigarettes is used quite often where it's like, when you tax the hell out of something, people are going to consume it less. But the issue is, if you don't offer people an alternative for transportation to get to work or something like that, then they don't care how much the gas costs, they're going to use it anyway, right? So I think when you try and implement something like that, it becomes, it polarizes both sides. You either need to say, okay, unfortunately, like we believe in climate change, unfortunately we have to, implement these policies that'll hurt a lot of oil and gas workers in the short term, but it'll be more beneficial to make sure that Alberta doesn't turn into something like Flint, where there was no incentives to have the automotive industry left, and then it was a ghost town, right? We want to make sure that Alberta,
Would it, instead of like a climate tax, would it not be more beneficial then in a country like ours that's like very spread out and it's hard for people to get around? Wouldn't it not be more beneficial to improve our public transit in lieu of a carbon tax? Because some people need to drive. They don't have an option. Like, they need to get from point A to point B, and there's no other way to get there unless they take their own transportation. And like investing in like the public infrastructure to decrease the carbon emissions would maybe be more beneficial, because it would create jobs and incentivize people to use those services rather than push a carbon tax on people that don't have any other option.
Now, to give the benefit of the doubt, I do know that I think it was like $150 million of carbon tax created revenue went towards the Valley LRT line in Edmonton. But I mean, I think there's better ways to sort of achieve that. Making public transportation free is one of them. But also, I mean, when roads need to be put in or fixed or something like that, you don't see people complaining as they do when a new LRT stop needs to be put in, and it needs to be put in the same conversation where public transportation is one of the ways that people is one of the ways that to mitigate climate change, and there's a lot of anxiety around the policy right now. So.
It's so hypocritical of the government to allow the Greyhound bus service to cut the majority of its routes and then put a carbon tax on gasoline, because these people don't have another option. Like, maybe the government should invest in like Greyhound busing so people can get around our huge country that it's not easy to like transport and stuff. So for them to allow a Greyhound to cut all these routes and then to put a carbon tax on gasoline, it just doesn't make any sense, because you're just hurting those people. Yes, exactly.
Well, I think that the government should have done first is to invest on transportation, so people have like a different output. Like, if we put a carbon tax, and then people will be like, okay, let's just do public transportation because carbon tax is increasing. Isn't that more better than putting a carbon tax and, as you said, removing the Greyhound and cutting it off? And then, of course, people would use more of their cars in traveling to point A to point B. So I think, as I said, public transportation should have come first, investing it, making it more available for people, especially when they're building new areas in Edmonton, like people are housing, right? Public transportation fares are very low, that sometimes they cut it off, and it's not beneficial for us who goes to school, work, and then go home late at night. I don't know, that's just my take on it.
I know, like, the one incentive that they had was people residing outside of Lethbridge, Edmonton, and Calgary census metropolitan areas.
Yeah.
They had a tax rebate to counteract the carbon tax that they were paying because those guys don't have a public transportation option. But there's nothing like that for people in the cities or even for outlying areas that are still part of those census areas. Like, Strathcona County is mostly rural. The bus system doesn't go out past the Sherwood Park limits. And so anyone residing outside there, they still have to drive, and they don't get a tax rebate for the carbon tax. So it's like they didn't do enough as far as tax incentives go to support the carbon tax, and it's still doing a lot of damage to those kinds of people.
I mean, I think it also comes down to like political will and like the amount. I mean, we've seen over the last 4 years, but even the last like 2 years, where climate change has become like the issue in terms of like political rhetoric, versus before it wasn't as much on the forefront. I mean, it's becoming more politicized now too, which is an issue. And then, you know, when it's politicized, when the UPC is in government now, then it's oil and gas or climate policy, where the two can't go hand in hand, which I know it's difficult to balance. But the more voters make that a priority, the more the federal government and hopefully the provincial government recognizes that it's an issue that people care about.
I think it was in Murphy's class last term. He said, there's always a crisis that people are obsessed about. So right now it's the coronavirus. A month ago it was like a nuclear war with Iran. That was the big thing. But the climate issue hasn't really degraded in time. It's been increased. So whether that's the crisis for this decade or for half the century, it's a persistent issue, and it's not gonna subside in the next year or two. So I think the government has to make long-term arrangements to accommodate it, and also, I mean, yeah, you said the people's will. It'll be that'll be a big factor because people aren't going to forget this kind of issue in the next 5 years. It'll be a lot longer than that.
The other issue is that when pipelines have been blocked for or not blocked, but it's been hard to get pipelines. I mean, through BC, the government, it was very difficult to get Energy East done. It was very difficult. But in the meantime, if you don't take so climate change is a very, very big issue, and I think you need to meet it with as big of policy incentives to be able to combat it. Because if you don't, we can see that there's no pipeline. Well, there's a lack of pipelines being built in Alberta, but in the meantime, we're still importing a lot of oil, especially from like Saudi Arabia. So the sooner you can become energy reliant on renewable energy, then at that point, maybe you can finally call out these places. I mean, an argument in the rhetoric of anti-climate, like denier sort of thing, is that our oil is ethical versus Saudi Arabia's is unethical. They have human rights abuses, which is true. But if you're energy reliant on clean energy and not importing any oil, you're not producing any oil in Alberta or importing any from Saudi Arabia, then you could call a spade, say Mohammed bin Salman, he is a horrible person, and finally do that without a fear of OPEC turning off the pipes again. So.